Let me introduce a concept that changes the compliance game for certain organizations. Not all data fiduciaries are treated equally. Some, because of their scale and impact, are designated as significant data fiduciaries and they carry a heavier set of obligations. In this chapter, we'll explore that designation and the regulator that oversees all of this, the Data Protection Board of India. We'll start by understanding who becomes a significant data fiduciary, or SDF, and the enhanced obligations they take on. We'll look at the requirement to appoint a data protection officer and an independent auditor, the duty to conduct annual data protection impact assessments and audits, and the interesting requirement around algorithmic fairness assessments. Then we'll turn to the Data Protection Board itself, what it is and how it functions, and we'll cover how complaints get filed and how the appeals process works. We'll walk through an SDF readiness snapshot as a worked example and finish with a checklist. Whether or not you're an SDF, understanding this tier and the board helps you see the full enforcement picture. So let's explore the top of the obligation pyramid and the body that oversees it all. Let's begin. Let's start by understanding who actually becomes a significant data fiduciary, because this designation triggers a whole set of heavier obligations. Here's the key concept. A significant data fiduciary, or SDF, is a data fiduciary or class of fiduciaries that the government designates as significant based on certain factors. So it's not something you simply opt into or out of. It's a designation tied to your characteristics and impact. What factors lead to this designation? The framework considers things like the volume and sensitivity of personal data you process, the risk to data principles, the potential impact on things like the sovereignty and integrity of India, electoral democracy, security, and public order. In essence, the bigger and more impactful your data processing, the more likely you fall into this category. Let me give you an intuitive sense of it. Think about how some institutions are designated as systemically important in finance, the ones so large and interconnected that their failure would ripple across the whole economy. They face stricter oversight precisely because of their significance. SDFs are an analogous idea in the data world, the organizations whose data processing is significant enough to warrant enhanced scrutiny. Here's why this matters for you. If you're a large platform processing vast amounts of sensitive personal data, you should anticipate the possibility of being designated an SDF and the heavier obligations that come with it. And even if you're not one, understanding this tier helps you see how the framework scales its demands with risk. Here's the instructor's takeaway. SDF status is about significance and impact. Know whether your scale and the nature of your data processing might place you in this category, because the obligations that follow are substantial. Now that you know who becomes an SDF, let's understand what that designation actually demands. Because SDFs carry obligations beyond those of ordinary data fiduciaries. Here's the overarching idea. With greater significance comes greater responsibility. SDFs are held to a higher standard of accountability, reflecting the larger impact their data processing has on individuals and society. So what are these enhanced obligations in broad strokes? SDFs are generally required to appoint a data protection officer to oversee compliance, engage an independent auditor to evaluate their practices, and conduct periodic data protection impact assessments and audits. They may also face requirements around assessing things like algorithmic fairness and other measures the government prescribes for this category. We'll dig into several of these individually in the coming lessons. Let me frame why this tiered approach makes sense. Imagine applying the most demanding requirements to every tiny business. It would be crushing and disproportionate. And imagine applying only light requirements to the largest, most impactful processors. It would be inadequate. The SDF tier solves this by concentrating the heaviest obligations where the risk and impact are greatest. Think of it like additional safety requirements for operating a large passenger aircraft versus a small private plane. The greater the potential consequences, the more rigorous the obligations. SDFs are the large aircraft of the data world. Here's the instructor's takeaway. If you're designated an SDF, you need to budget real resources and attention for these enhanced obligations. They're not trivial, and understanding them, even as a non-SDF, shows you the full arc of how accountability scales with significance under this framework. Let's now look at the specific enhanced duties in detail. Let's examine two specific people that significant data fiduciaries must bring into the picture: a data protection officer and an independent auditor. These roles are central to the enhanced accountability expected of SDFs. Start with the Data Protection Officer, or DPO. An SDF is required to appoint a DPO, an individual responsible for overseeing data protection compliance within the organization. Think of the DPO as the dedicated guardian of privacy inside the company, the person whose job is to make sure data protection is actually being done right. The framework also contemplates that the DPO be based in India and serve as a point of contact, including for grievance redressal, and be accountable to the organization's leadership. Why does having a designated DPO matter? Because without someone specifically owning data protection, it tends to become everyone's job and therefore no one's job. The DPO ensures there's clear accountability and expertise at the helm. Think of it like having a dedicated safety officer at a large facility, someone whose specific role is to keep safety front and center rather than leaving it to chance. Now, the independent auditor. SDFs are also required to have their data processing audited by an independent party. The word independent is key here. An outside objective evaluation carries far more credibility than a self-assessment where you grade your own homework. Think about why financial audits are done by external auditors. The independence is what makes the audit trustworthy. Here's the instructor's takeaway. For SDFs, these two roles, an internal DPO owning compliance and an external independent auditor providing objective scrutiny, work together to create genuine, credible accountability. If you're an SDF, securing the right people for both roles is a foundational step. Let's look at a recurring obligation that keeps SDFs continuously accountable: the requirement to conduct data protection impact assessments and audits on a periodic, typically annual basis. Start with the Data Protection Impact Assessment, or DPIA. A DPIA is essentially a structured evaluation of the risks your data processing poses to individuals and how you're mitigating those risks. Think of it as a regular health checkup, but for your data practices. Why does this matter? Because risks aren't static. Your processing changes, new features launch, new data gets collected, and fresh risks emerge. A DPIA forces you to periodically step back and honestly assess: what are we doing with personal data, what could go wrong, and how are we protecting people? It's proactive risk management rather than waiting for something to break. Think about how a regular medical checkup catches problems early before they become serious. ADPIA does the same for privacy risks, surfacing issues while you can still address them. Now, audits. Alongside DPIAs, SDFs undergo periodic audits, often through that independent auditor we discussed, to evaluate whether their data protection practices actually measure up. The DPIA is more about assessing risk, while the audit is about verifying compliance and effectiveness. They complement each other. Here's the key word for both: periodic. This isn't a one-time exercise you do once and forget. The expectation is regular, typically annual repetition, because compliance is an ongoing discipline, not a one-off achievement. Here's the instructor's takeaway. If you're an SDF, build DPIAs and audits into your annual rhythm as recurring commitments. Treat them not as bureaucratic hurdles, but as genuine tools for catching risks early and proving your practices are sound. Done well, they protect both your data principles and your organization. Let's explore one of the more forward-looking obligations that can apply to significant data fiduciaries: assessing the fairness of their algorithms. This reflects an awareness that in the modern world, data isn't just stored, it's fed into algorithms that make or influence decisions about people. Here's the concept. SDFs may be required to take measures around verifying that the algorithmic systems they use, particularly those processing personal data, don't pose risks to data principles, including risks related to fairness. In plainer terms, if you're using algorithms to make decisions about people, you need to pay attention to whether those algorithms are fair. Why is this such an important and timely concern? Because algorithms can quietly embed bias and produce unfair outcomes at massive scale. Think about an algorithm used to make decisions about people in lending, hiring, or service eligibility. If that algorithm is biased, perhaps because of the data it learned from, it could systematically disadvantage certain groups and do so invisibly, affecting thousands of people. Let me give you a relatable example. Imagine a system that decides who gets shown certain opportunities. If it's quietly skewed against a particular group, that's a serious fairness problem, even if no human intended it. The harm is real even when the bias is unintentional. Here's the instructor's takeaway. For SDFs using algorithmic systems, fairness isn't optional, it's something to actively assess and safeguard. This obligation pushes organizations to look inside their algorithmic black boxes and ask hard questions about fairness and harm. It's a recognition that protecting people's data also means protecting them from unfair automated decisions made using that data. If your organization relies on consequential algorithms, take this seriously because the impact on real people can be profound. Let's turn now to the body at the center of enforcement, the Data Protection Board of India. Understanding the board is essential because it's the institution that gives the entire framework its teeth. So what is the board? The Data Protection Board of India is the regulatory authority established under the framework to oversee compliance, handle certain matters like breach reports and complaints, and impose penalties where warranted. Think of it as the referee and enforcer of the data protection rules. Why does having a dedicated board matter? Because rules without an enforcer are just suggestions. The board is what turns the obligations we've discussed into real, consequential requirements. When we talked about reporting breaches within 72 hours, it's the board you report to. When we discussed penalties reaching significant sums, it's the board that can impose them. The board is where accountability becomes concrete. Let me give you a sense of its role through analogy. Think of how a regulatory authority in another domain, say a financial or telecom regulator, oversees its sector, sets expectations, investigates issues, and penalizes wrongdoing. The Data Protection Board plays that role for personal data protection in India. Here's something worth noting about how the board is envisioned to function. The framework contemplates it operating as a digital by design body, meaning much of its functioning, including how complaints and proceedings are handled, is intended to leverage digital processes. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Get familiar with the board because it's your primary regulatory counterpart under this framework. It's who you'll report certain things to, who individuals can escalate complaints to, and who holds the power to enforce. Understanding the board's role helps you appreciate that these rules aren't abstract. There's a real authority standing behind them, ready to hold organizations accountable. Let's understand the process side of the board's work, how complaints get filed, and what happens when there are appeals. This shows you the framework's mechanism for resolving disputes and grievances. Start with filing complaints. When a data principal believes their rights have been violated and they haven't gotten satisfaction through the organization's own grievance process, they can escalate to the Data Protection Board. The board can then look into the matter. Remember our earlier discussion of grievance redressal. This is the external tier that sits above the organization's internal handling. So picture the flow from the individual's side. First, they raise the issue with the data fiduciary directly. If that doesn't resolve things, they can bring a complaint to the board, which has the authority to investigate and act. This tiered structure encourages problems to be solved at the organization level first, while providing a real escalation path when they aren't. Now, the appeals process. Decisions don't necessarily end with the board. The framework provides for an appellate mechanism, meaning parties who are dissatisfied with the board's decision have an avenue to appeal. Think of it like the court system, where a decision at one level can be appealed to a higher one. This ensures there's a check, a way to seek review rather than being stuck with a single final decision. Think about why appeals matter in any fair system. They provide a safeguard against errors and ensure decisions can be scrutinized. The data protection framework builds in that same fairness. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Understand this dispute resolution architecture: internal grievance handling first, then the board, then appeals. Whether you're an organization on the receiving end of a complaint or thinking about how individuals seek justice, knowing this process helps you engage with it properly and appreciate that the framework includes real, structured avenues for resolution and review. Let's consolidate everything by walking through an SDF readiness snapshot, a practical way to assess whether a significant data fiduciary is actually prepared for its enhanced obligations. Picture a large digital platform called ConnectSphere that processes enormous volumes of personal data and has been designated or anticipates being designated an SDF. Let's snapshot their readiness. We go obligation by obligation, checking what's in place. First, the data protection officer. Does ConnectSphere have a qualified DPO appointed, based appropriately, owning compliance and serving as a contact point? Let's say they have someone, but that person is juggling it part-time alongside another role, a readiness gap worth flagging. Next, the independent auditor. Have they engaged a genuinely independent auditor? Suppose they've been relying on internal reviews only. That's a gap, since independence is required. Now, DPIAs and audits. Are these happening on a regular annual basis? Imagine they did one assessment 2 years ago and nothing since. Another gap, because the expectation is periodic. Algorithmic fairness. Given ConnectSphere uses algorithms to curate and decide things for users, are they assessing those for fairness? Suppose they've never formally done so, a significant gap given their reliance on algorithms. See how the snapshot quickly reveals where they stand and where they fall short. Each gap becomes a priority. Now here's your exercise. If your organization is or might become an SDF, run this same snapshot. Do you have a proper DPO, an independent auditor, regular DPIAs and audits, and algorithmic fairness assessments where relevant? Honestly marking each as ready or a gap gives you an immediate, actionable readiness picture. This snapshot is how an SDF turns a daunting set of obligations into a concrete to-do list. Let's wrap up this chapter with a checklist focused on significant data fiduciaries and engaging with the board. Start with the threshold question. Have you assessed whether your organization is or could be designated a significant data fiduciary based on factors like the volume and sensitivity of data you process and your potential impact? Now, if you are an SDF, go through the enhanced obligations. Have you appointed a qualified data protection officer who genuinely owns compliance and serves as a contact point? Have you engaged a truly independent auditor, not just internal reviewers? Are you conducting data protection impact assessments and audits on a regular, periodic basis rather than as one-off events? If you use consequential algorithms, are you assessing them for fairness and the risks they pose to data principles? Now the regulatory relationship, relevant to everyone. Do you understand the Data Protection Board's role? And are you prepared to interact with it, including reporting breaches and responding to any complaints? Do you understand the escalation path, internal grievance handling, then the board, then appeals? And finally, the readiness test for SDFs. If the board scrutinized your enhanced obligations tomorrow, could you demonstrate genuine compliance across all of them? Run this checklist to ensure that if you carry the weight of SDF status, you're actually meeting it, and that whatever your size, you understand the enforcement framework you operate within. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you're notified when the next chapter goes live, where we bring everything together into a practical compliance roadmap.